I'm 30 years old, and on a quiet Thursday morning this past spring, I sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building in the city, signed my name on the last of 3 property documents, and became the owner of every available home on the street where I grew up. I was wearing a navy blazer. My coffee had gone cold. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, and I remember thinking how ordinary it all felt, how paperwork always feels ordinary no matter what it means. My solicitor, a calm woman named Patricia, slid the final folder across the table. I read each page the way I always do, slowly, carefully, top to bottom, and then I signed. No hesitation, no dramatic pause, just a pen moving across paper the way it had dozens of times before. And then my phone rang. I saw the name on the screen before I heard the sound. I looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then I picked up. Priya. My mother's voice was tight, not the tightness of grief, the tightness of someone who needs something and is already calculating how to ask for it. There's a situation with the house. I didn't say anything. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below. She told me that letters had arrived from the bank, that payments were behind, that the house on Elm Crescent, was facing a forced sale notice if the arrears weren't cleared within 60 days. Her voice moved quickly, practically, covering the facts before circling back to the thing she actually wanted to say, which was, "We need you to fix this." She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the last 2 years of silence between us. She said, "Your father doesn't know I'm calling. I didn't want to worry him." I pressed my fingers lightly against the cold glass of the window. Somewhere below that window, 4 streets away, was Elm Crescent, a street of terraced houses with connected lawns and shared fences. A street I had not walked down in over a year. A street that, as of 40 minutes ago, my company now owned in significant part. I felt something in that moment, but it wasn't anger. Anger had left me a long time ago. What I felt was quieter than anger and more settled, the feeling of a long story arriving at its final chapter. "I'll look into it, Mom," I said. I hung up. Patricia looked at me from the table. I turned back to the room, picked up my pen, and finished signing. And if you've ever had to hold yourself very still on the outside while something large and complicated moves through you on the inside, you'll understand exactly what that room felt like. Because this story didn't start that morning. It started 14 years earlier, on a different Thursday, when I was 16 years old, and came home from a shift at a stationery shop to find my bedroom door open and someone else's bags on my floor. But to understand that night, you have to understand the house. And to understand the house, you have to go back further still, to the beginning, to the street, to the family I was born into, and what it cost me to love them the way I did. Let me tell you everything. I grew up on Elm Crescent, not the way people say they grew up somewhere to mean they lived there briefly. And I mean I was raised in that street the way a tree is raised in soil, rooted, shaped by it, defined by its particular quality of light. I knew which neighbors put their bins out early. I knew which garden had the rose bushes that bloomed in June. I knew that the family at number 11 argued loudly every Friday and were perfectly pleasant the rest of the week. I knew that street, the way you only know a place when you've walked it thousands of times without thinking. Our house was number 23, a terraced house mid-row with a small front garden my father kept neat and a kitchen that always smelled of cumin and dish soap. We had 3 bedrooms upstairs, one for my parents, one for my younger brother Rohan, and one for me. My room faced the back garden. In the mornings, I could hear the neighbor's radio through the wall. My father, Suresh, worked at a textile warehouse on the edge of the industrial estate. He left at 6:30 every morning and came back at 6 in the evening smelling of dye and effort. He wasn't a man who talked much. He communicated through small acts, the way he'd leave a glass of water on my desk when I was studying late, the way he'd fix the draft under the kitchen door without anyone asking. He was a quiet man, and in those days, I thought his quietness meant safety. My mother, Anita, ran the house and everything in it, including, in her own way, the people inside it. She was intelligent. I want to say that clearly because it matters. She wasn't a small or simple woman. She had opinions about politics, about education, about the correct way to do almost everything. She read newspapers. She remembered things. She could have done a great deal with her life if she'd been given a different set of circumstances or different courage. But she had grown up in a family where women managed things quietly and never asked for too much. And somewhere along the way, she had accepted that model and made it her own. She managed our image on Elm Crescent the way a shopkeeper manages a window display, always thinking about what was visible, always arranging things to look their best from the outside. Rohan was 4 years younger than me. He was a cheerful, energetic boy who could charm anyone in a room within 5 minutes. I loved him in the uncomplicated way you love someone you've known since they were small enough to carry. But even as a child, I could see how differently our parents looked at us. Not unkindly toward me. Not at first. But differently. Or Rohan's mistakes were met with patience. Mine were met with correction. Rohan's achievements were celebrated with dinner out. Mine were noted and filed away, like useful information. I told myself it was because he was younger. I told myself it was just the way families worked. And then Mira came into our lives, and I began to understand that the difference wasn't about age at all. Mira was my mother's sister's daughter. She lived 3 streets away and visited often. A girl a year younger than me, with a wide smile and a talent for making adults feel important. When Mira came over, my mother's whole face changed. She laughed more freely. She brought out the better biscuits. She asked questions and listened to the answers with her full attention in a way she rarely gave to me. I noticed. I was young, but I wasn't blind. I noticed, and I filed it away, and I didn't say anything. Because in our house, saying something like that, pointing to the difference, naming the feeling, would have been called oversensitive, dramatic. It would have turned into a conversation about my attitude rather than about what I had actually seen. So I stayed quiet, and I watched, and I tried harder, 'cause that was the only response I knew. Have you ever tried harder for someone who had already decided how much you were worth to them? If you have, then you know that trying harder doesn't change the calculation. It just costs you more. By the time I was 12, I was cooking dinner twice a week. By 13, I was the one who noticed when the household budget was running short and quietly stopped asking for things. By 14, I was helping my father with the heating bill calculations because his English paperwork confused him and I was good with numbers. And so nobody asked me to do any of this. I did it because I could see it needed doing, and I was the sort of person who couldn't look away from something that needed doing. I thought, for a long time, that this was love. That love was practical. That it showed up as usefulness. That the right way to be a daughter was to be the daughter who solved problems before they became problems. I was wrong. But it took me a long time to learn the difference between being loved and being relied upon. The favoritism in our house wasn't brutal. I want to be honest about that, because the truth is more complicated than brutality. It wasn't that my mother hit me and praised Rohan. It wasn't that obvious or that clean. And it was slower than that, and in some ways the slowness made it harder to name, harder to defend against. Rohan was 10 when my parents hired a private tutor for him, a young man from the university who came every Tuesday and Thursday and worked through his maths with him at the kitchen table. I was 14. I had the same exams coming. Nobody hired a tutor for me. When I asked once, carefully, whether I might join those sessions, my mother said, "You manage fine on your own." She said it like it was a compliment. I understood, even then, that it was the opposite of one. When Rohan had exams, the house went quiet for him. He was excused from washing up, from taking out the bins, from helping carry the shopping in from the car. My mother would shush my father if he turned the television up, so she'd leave snacks outside Rohan's door so he didn't have to come downstairs. When Rohan had exams, the whole household reorganized around his comfort. When I had the same exams, and I did every year at the same age he eventually would, I had the same chores I always had. I cooked, I cleaned, I helped. I sat at my desk afterward and studied until my eyes hurt, and nobody left snacks outside my door. I passed my exams. I did well. When I came home with a school award, a certificate for top marks in English and mathematics, my mother looked at it and said, "Don't get too proud. Pride makes people careless." I remember standing in the kitchen holding that certificate and feeling something go quiet inside me. Not dramatically, just a small, specific quieting, the way a light dims rather than switches off. When Rohan passed his exams with average marks, my mother made his favorite dinner and invited my aunt and uncle over. My father shook his hand. The mood at the house was warm and expansive in a way it had never been for me. I sat at that dinner table and smiled and said the right things, and underneath the smile, I was doing what I always did in those moments. I was making myself smaller, taking up less space, convincing myself that the difference wasn't real, or that it didn't matter, or that I was lucky, because at least I was capable enough not to need what Rohan needed. That last thought was the most damaging one of all. Mira's visits became more frequent when her parents' marriage started to have problems. I was 15 by then. And I could understand enough of the adult conversations happening in lowered voices to know that Mira's home life was uncertain. My mother began to treat Mira not as a niece who visited, but as a second daughter, except that the warmth she gave Mira was different from what she gave me. Mira got the better chair at dinner. Mira got asked how she was feeling, what she was thinking, what she wanted for her future. Mira was called Beta, a term of affection in our language, gentle and warm. I was called by my name, just Priya, clear and functional like a label on a box. I started a part-time job that year, Saturdays at a stationery shop 3 streets away, a small place that sold paper and pens and art supplies and school things. I told my parents it was because I wanted to save for university. My mother's face tightened when I told her. She said, "What will people think? A girl from our family working a shop counter." "People will think I'm saving for university," I said. She didn't respond to that. I took the job. I worked every Saturday for the next 18 months. I earned £60 a week. I gave 30 of it to my mother without making a thing of it. Just left it on the kitchen counter on Saturday evenings when I got home. She took it. She never thanked me. She never said anything about it at all. My father heard me come in one Saturday and looked up from the television. I thought for a moment he was going to say something. He looked at me for a few seconds. Then he looked back at the screen. I went upstairs and washed the shop smell off my hands and started my homework. I think about that moment sometimes. What it would have meant if he had said something, even something small, even just my name, but he didn't. And I finished my homework and I went to sleep, and the next morning I got up and did it all again. Tell me in the comments if any of this sounds familiar. Because I've heard from enough people to know that this kind of quiet, ordinary neglect, the kind that never leaves a bruise, the kind you can't quite explain without sounding dramatic, is more common than most people say out loud. I need you to understand something about the night I left, because people often get this wrong when they hear stories like mine. I didn't leave because I had a breakdown. I didn't scream or throw things or have the kind of falling out that makes for a clean narrative. I left because my mother made a practical decision, and when I responded to it with the only dignity I had left. That's the whole story of that night. The details are what make it devastating. It was a Saturday in late October. I had worked a full shift at the shop, 7 hours, mostly alone at the counter because the owner had taken the day off. It had been a long shift. I remember the smell of fresh paper and the slight ache in my feet from standing. I walked home in the early dark, the kind that comes too early in autumn and always makes the street feel smaller. I pushed open the front door. The hallway smelled of cooking. I heard voices from the kitchen, my mother's voice, and another lighter voice that I recognized immediately. I walked upstairs first, the way I always did, bag on my shoulder, shoes still on. My door was open, so I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. Mira's bags were on my floor. Not her bag, bags. A large suitcase, a smaller hold-all, a box of things. Her jacket was already over the back of my desk chair. Her hairbrush was on my windowsill. I turned around and walked back downstairs. My feet felt very deliberate on the steps. My mother was at the kitchen table. When she saw my face, she stood up. She didn't look guilty. She looked ready. The way someone looks when they've prepared for a conversation. "Mira needs a room," she said before I could speak. "Her mother is leaving the city. She has nowhere stable to go. You understand that?" I said, "Where are my things?" She said, "I moved them to the hallway cupboard. You can stay on the sofa for a while. Or Dana has that spare room. You've always said, 'You moved my things.' Priya." Her tone carried a warning. "Don't make this into something larger than it is." And there it was, that phrase, "Don't make this into something larger than it is," as if I had a habit of exaggerating, as if the thing happening in front of me was not already large, as if a 16-year-old girl coming home from a 7-hour shift to find her room reassigned to someone else while she was out, as if that required any exaggeration at all. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that clearly. Not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nothing to say that would have changed anything. I had known my mother my entire life. I knew when a decision had already been made, and this one had been made before I walked through the door. I went to the hallway cupboard. It was small, the kind used for coats and the vacuum cleaner and things that didn't belong anywhere else. My books were stacked on the floor, my school folders, my winter coat folded on top of a box, my savings envelope tucked between two textbooks where she'd left it. I took the envelope, 47 pounds, every Saturday saving that I hadn't given to the household. I put what I could into my school bag, my folders, my books, my coat, my wash things. I moved quietly and quickly, the way I'd learned to move through that house, taking up as little space as possible. I passed the living room on my way out. My father was sitting in his chair. The television was on. He looked up when I passed the doorway. He looked at me holding my school bag. He looked at my coat. He looked back at the television. He opened the front door and walked out. I want to stay with that moment for just a second longer because I think it deserves it. I was 16 years old. I was wearing my work shoes. I had 47 pounds in an envelope and a school bag and a coat. Outside, it was cold and already dark, and I was the calmest I had been in months. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping for something, when you finally accept that the thing you've been waiting for, the recognition, the warmth, the moment someone chooses you, is not coming. It's painful, but it is also, in a strange way, clean. I walked to Dana's house. It was 4 streets away. I knocked on the door, and when Dana opened it and saw my face, she didn't ask a single question. She just said, "Come in." Her mother made me tea, and they found me a blanket for the sofa. Dana sat with me until midnight, just talking about ordinary things. A film she'd seen, a book she was reading, the way the leaves had all turned at once that week. She didn't make me explain, or perform, or justify. She just sat with me the way a good person sits with someone who's had a hard day. That night, on Dana's sofa, with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside me, I made a decision. I didn't write it down or say it out loud. I just felt it settle into me, quiet and certain, the way important things do. I was not going back, and I was going to build something that no one could take away from me. I stayed with Dana's family for almost 3 months. Her parents never made me feel like a burden. They set a place for me at the table without discussion. In return, I helped with the washing up, walked their dog on weekday mornings, and made sure I never asked for more than was offered. I had learned early how to live lightly in other people's spaces. I finished my school year from Dana's address. I had 2 exams that spring, and I sat both of them with my fingers steady and my mind clear. I got the grades I needed, not because it was easy, because I had no other option. Failure was a luxury I couldn't afford. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I spent hours in the school library going through lists, forms, eligibility criteria. I got 2 small grants, one from the local council, a care-adjacent support fund for young people in unstable housing, and one from a charitable foundation attached to the university I was hoping to attend. Combined, they gave me enough to manage the first year if I was careful. I was very careful. At 18, I received my university offer. Business and property management at a city university, 45 minutes by train. I had chosen the course deliberately, not on instinct or passion, but because I had sat in the library one afternoon and thought very clearly about what I wanted my life to look like in 10 years, and then worked backward to find the discipline that would get me there. Property was logical. It was tangible. It was the one asset class I had understood emotionally before I understood it academically, because I had grown up in a house I didn't own, and I had felt in a very physical way what it meant to be removable. I worked 2 jobs during my degree, evenings at a supermarket and weekend mornings at a cafe near the campus, and I was tired most of the time in a way that went beyond the body. But I was also, for the first time in my life, building something that belonged entirely to me, a routine, a record, a future that no one had the authority to reassign. I lived in shared student accommodation in first year, 4 people to a flat, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was always slightly too cold. In second year, a bedsit above a laundrette. In third year, a shared flat with 2 other women my age, a nurse named Carrie and a design student named Yemi, where we took turns cooking and left each other notes about milk and weekend plans. It was, in its own way, the warmest home I had lived in since I was small. During all of those years, my family contacted me. I want to be accurate about what I mean by that, because contacted me makes it sound warmer than it was. And they did not call to ask how I was doing. They did not send birthday messages or ask about my studies. They called when something needed fixing or funding. My mother rang twice in my first year to ask for money. The first time, it was for Rohan's school trip, 60 pounds. The second time, it was a contribution toward the household heating bill. She framed both calls in the same way, as if I were an adult member of the household with financial responsibilities, rather than an 18-year-old who had been sent away with 47 pounds and a school bag. I sent the money. Both times. I know how that sounds. I've had to explain it to people before, and most of them look at me with a kind of frustrated confusion. Why would you send money to people who pushed you out? And the honest answer is that I couldn't separate the people from the situation. I couldn't stop caring about my father being cold, or my brother missing a school trip because of money I was able to send. I had learned to love people while seeing them clearly, and in that early period, the love was still louder than the clarity. Dana came to my graduation. She took the train by herself, stood in the rain outside the university hall with a bunch of flowers from the supermarket, and clapped loudly enough that I could hear her from the stage. Nobody else came. I had mentioned the date to my mother 6 weeks earlier in a brief phone call. She said, "We'll see." They didn't come. I found Dana afterward in the courtyard, and she hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "I am so proud of you." Just like that. Simple and true. I had to look away because I didn't want to cry in my graduation gown in a university courtyard. But the truth is, those 4 words meant more to me that day than almost anything else I had received in my life up to that point. At 23, I made my first property purchase, a shared ownership flat, 30% equity in a 2-room apartment 40 minutes from the city center. Small, east-facing, on the 3rd floor of a converted building. The carpets were old. The kitchen was functional rather than beautiful. The windows had a slight rattle in high wind. I furnished it with second-hand pieces. A table from a charity shop, a sofa from an online listing, collected in a rented van Dana helped me drive. A bookshelf I put together myself on the kitchen floor with a small screwdriver and a lot of patience. The evening I finished setting it up, I sat on my second-hand sofa and looked at the room. It was not a beautiful flat, but every single thing in it was mine. Chosen by me, paid for by me, belonging to me in a way that no one had the legal or emotional authority to override. It was the most beautiful place I had ever lived. By 26, I had sold that flat at a modest profit, £12,000 after fees, and used it as a deposit on 2 further properties. I was methodical. I studied market cycles. I learned about lease structures, service charges, planning permissions, rental yields. I treated every acquisition like an exam I had to pass without a tutor, which meant I studied harder than people who had safety nets below them. I didn't rush. Patience was the one thing I had learned at an early age and never lost. You can't be raised in a house where you wait years to be seen and not learn how to be patient. During this period, my contact with my family became very sparse. Not hostile, just quiet. I sent money on 2 more occasions when I could afford to. When my mother had a minor health scare, my brother Rohan called me. It was the most direct conversation we had ever had, just the 2 of us, without the architecture of family around it. He sounded young and a little frightened. I told him to make sure she saw a GP and sent £300 for the consultation and any tests. I told him I hoped she felt better. He said, "Why don't you come home?" He said, "I'll call soon." And then I didn't call soon, and he didn't push it. I was 27 when I stopped sending money. Not in anger, not in any dramatic moment of decision. Just slowly. So the way you stop doing something when you finally accepted that it was never going to be enough to change what you both knew was true. I didn't need to be repaid. I didn't need an apology. I just needed to stop. If you've ever loved someone who only reached out when they needed something, you know the specific exhaustion of that. The way it doesn't make you stop loving them. It just makes you stop answering as quickly. I was 28 years old, sitting in a meeting room in my own offices, when everything that had been building for 14 years found its direction. My property analyst, a sharp and thorough young woman named Adiz, was presenting opportunities for the next quarter's portfolio expansion. She had spent 2 weeks researching residential streets in and around several commuter towns within an hour of the city. Streets with older housing stock, low current valuations, and strong infrastructure links that suggested rising long-term demand. She showed me a spreadsheet. Then she pulled up a map. "This one is particularly interesting," she said, moving her cursor to a street highlighted in yellow. "Elm Crescent, working-class residential street, good transport links, several properties recently sold below market value to a developer. Looks like he's been purchasing quietly, possibly in anticipation of a planning application. 3 properties currently in arrears or with distressed owners open to offers. 1 larger development opportunity at the end of the terrace. She continued speaking. I looked at the map. So I knew that street. I knew the shape of it, the specific curve at the top where the road bends slightly before the post box. I knew the texture of the pavement outside number 23, which had been cracked and uneven for as long as I could remember, and apparently still was, because the satellite image hadn't changed it. I said, "Leave that one with me. Go on to the next." Adai's moved on. I wrote the street name on my notepad. I underlined it once, which I never do. Then I turned the page. That evening, I sat at my desk at home for a long time before I opened the property database. The room was quiet except for the sound of traffic 3 floors below. I made a cup of tea and let it cool next to me while I pulled up Elm Crescent in the system. The information was all there, in the way information always is when you know where to look. My parents' house, number 23, had been remortgaged twice. The first remortgage 7 years ago, the second 4 years ago. The current arrears were listed at just over £8,000, 60 days to respond to the forced sale notice from the lender. I looked at the neighboring properties. 3 immediate opportunities. Number 17, sold by an elderly couple who had moved to sheltered housing. Number 28, vacant since a probate settlement. Number 31, listed by the estate of a former owner. All 3 had been identified by the same developer, a company I didn't recognize. A small portfolio operation, likely a private investor buying ahead of a planning application that hadn't been submitted yet. I closed the database, and I made myself a fresh cup of tea. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for about 20 minutes, just thinking. I want to be honest about what happened in those 20 minutes, because I think it matters. I have told this story to a small number of people, and the first question most of them ask is, were you doing it to hurt them? Was this revenge? And my honest answer is, I sat in that kitchen, and I asked myself that question very carefully. I turned it over from every angle. I looked at my own motivations the way I look at a property before acquisition, looking for structural weaknesses, looking for things I might be lying to myself about. What I found was this: the investment was genuinely sound. In the developer acquiring those properties below market rate was operating on the assumption that no better capitalized buyer would move into that street. Adez was right. It was a strong opportunity. I would have pursued it without any personal connection. And beyond the investment, there was something else, something true and clear that I had to sit with. I had earned the right to own any ground I chose to stand on. I had built my company from £47 and a school bag. I had studied and worked and sacrificed and been patient. No one could take that away. No one could tell me that this particular street, this particular curve of road with the cracked pavement, was beyond my reach. It was not revenge. It was completion. I called Patricia the next morning, and I told her I wanted to move on Elm Crescent, the 3 available properties initially, with an option to acquire further if the development opportunity at number 31 progressed. She took notes. She asked her questions. She got started. I told Dana 3 days later, over dinner at her kitchen table. She listened. She looked at me carefully when I finished. She didn't ask whether it was revenge. She asked whether I was sure. I said yes. She nodded and refilled my glass and said, "Then let's make sure it's done properly." Dana had always been my anchor, the kind of friend who doesn't tell you what you want to hear, who asks the sharper question, who shows up with flowers in the rain when no one else does. I don't know what my life would look like without her, and I've never wanted to find out. The acquisitions took 11 weeks. Patricia was efficient. The developer on number 17 had already exchanged and couldn't be moved. But 17 wasn't the priority. 28 and 31 transferred to my holding company inside 8 weeks. The third acquisition, a further property at number 9, came through in week 11. My company now had a meaningful ownership stake in Elm Crescent, enough to be relevant, enough to require engagement with the existing residents. Patricia's team sent formal letters to all residents on the street, introducing the company, outlining renovation plans, and inviting them to a community information meeting at the local hall 2 weeks hence. The letters were professional and transparent. They detailed the plans clearly. External improvements, maintained rental rates for existing long-term occupants, a right of first refusal option for any resident wishing to purchase their property. The letters went out on a Tuesday. On Thursday, my mother called. Her voice was tight in that familiar way. She had received the letter. She wanted to know who this company was. She said the name on the letter didn't mean anything to her. I said I'd look into it. On the evening of the community meeting, I arrived at the local hall 30 minutes early. It was a low building I remembered from childhood, the same scuffed floor, the same smell of old heating and plastic chairs. Someone had set up rows facing a small presentation table. The room was filling with people I had once known by sight, familiar faces, some significantly older than I remembered them, some entirely new to the street. I took a seat at the back. Adazi ran the presentation. She was composed and thorough, explaining the company's plans in clear terms, showing visuals of the proposed external renovations, walking through the lease protection terms. She was good at this, clear and patient with questions, neither defensive nor dismissive. The room was attentive. People had concerns. They always do, and rightly so. Questions about rental increases, about the timeline, about what would happen to the older residents. Adais answered each one directly. At one point, a man near the front said, "Who owns this company? You keep saying the company. Who is it, actually?" Adais looked toward the back of the room. She said, "The founder and director is here this evening, actually. She can introduce herself if she's comfortable, too." I stood up. The room turned. I was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, so no blazer that evening. I looked like a person who lived in a neighborhood rather than someone performing authority. That had been deliberate. I said, "My name is Priya Sharma. I founded the company 8 years ago. I grew up on this street, actually, at number 23. I wanted to be here in person this evening." Silence. The particular quality of silence that happens when a room is recalibrating something. From the third row, a woman turned slowly in her chair. My mother. Beside her, my father. I had known they would be there. I had known this would be the moment. Her face moved through things in quick succession. Confusion first. She didn't connect the name on the letter to me because the company used my middle name in its trading identity, and it genuinely hadn't occurred to her. Then recognition. Then something I didn't have a precise word for. A complex of emotions that moved across her features like weather moving over a landscape. My father just looked at me. He looked at me for a very long time, the way he had looked at me in the hallway when I was 16 with a school bag over my shoulder. Except this time, I was standing at the back of a room full of our neighbors, and I was the one with the information they all needed. I heard Mrs. Okafor from number 12, a woman who had known me since I was 8 years old, who had once given me a biscuit through the fence when I was sitting in the garden crying about something I no longer remember. I heard her say my name, quietly. Priya? Just like that. And the room shifted. Conversations started up. Somebody laughed. Not meanly. Just the release of tension. See, people began asking me questions directly rather than routing everything through a Des, and I answered them all. I was there for another 40 minutes. I shook hands. I listened to concerns. A man named Gerald from number 4, who had lived on the street for 32 years, said, "You've done well for yourself, love." He meant it kindly. I thanked him. When the meeting ended and people began filing out, I was collecting my folder from the chair beside me when I heard footsteps stop close by. I knew before I looked up. My mother stood a few feet away. My father was just behind her, slightly to her right, not quite meeting my eyes. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said, "Priya, I looked at her. I let a moment pass. I wasn't cold. I wasn't warm. I was just present, the way you can be when you've already finished grieving something. I said, "I'll have my team send you the tenant options document. It covers everything you need to know about the property situation." She said, "I'm talking about family." I said, "I know." I picked up my folder. The document will answer all your questions. Patricia's details are at the top of the letter. I walked past them and out into the evening air. The door of the hall closed behind me. Outside, the street smelled of autumn and someone's cooking and the faint trace of car exhaust. The sky was dark blue and very clear. A few stars were already visible. Dana was leaning against her car 20 meters away, 2 takeaway coffees in her hands. She handed me one without a word. We drove. The city lights came up around us. Neither of us said much for a while. And in the quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who have been honest with each other for a very long time. Eventually, Dana said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "Finished. I feel finished." She nodded. She drove. Real life doesn't end in the way stories are supposed to end. There's no scene where someone falls to their knees. There's no apology that covers everything. There is no moment where years of damage are repaired by a single conversation. I want to be honest about what happened after, because I think the honest version is more useful than the dramatic version. My parents accepted the tenant terms. They remained in the house at number 23, now under a formal protected tenancy agreement with my company. The terms were fair, as I made sure of that, not as a kindness in the traditional sense, but because I run an ethical operation and because fair terms for all residents was always the plan. Rohan called me about a month later. The conversation was short and slightly awkward. He said something about family and how things should be different, and I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I hope you're well, Rohan. I mean that." And I did mean it. Mira, I learned from Dana, had moved away years ago and built a quiet life in another city. She had her own difficulties, her own story, her own reckoning with the family she had come from. I held no particular feeling toward her. She had been a girl in an uncertain situation, placed in a room that wasn't meant for her, through no decision of her own. Whatever she did with that was her story, not mine. What I think about, when I think about all of it, not often now, but sometimes, on early mornings when the light is coming in at a low angle and the city hasn't quite started yet, is not the meeting room or the community hall or the moment my mother's face changed. I think about a girl of 16, in work shoes and a winter coat, walking out of a house on Elm Crescent on a Thursday evening in October with 47 pounds in an envelope and a school bag over one shoulder. I think about what she deserved and didn't get: the tutor, the celebration dinner, the word beta said with warmth, a parent who got up from the chair, even something small, even just her name said with tenderness. She deserved those things. She didn't get them. And no property portfolio, no community meeting, no tenant options document ever changes that. Some absences are permanent. You learn to live around them the way a city learns to build around the space where a building used to stand. But here is what I also know, and what I want to say plainly to anyone listening who has ever been the useful one, the capable one, the one who was relied upon without being cherished. No one is coming to rescue you from the family that failed you. That rescue is not coming. And waiting for it is the most expensive thing you can do with your life. But you are allowed to rescue yourself. You are allowed to choose the people who see you, really see you, the way Dana saw me in a doorway on a Thursday evening and said, "Come in," without asking for an explanation. You are allowed to build something so solid that the instability of other people's choices can no longer reach you. You are allowed to succeed in the specific direction that matters to you, for reasons that are yours alone. And you are allowed to do all of that without hatred, without bitterness, without spending one more day of your life in the cold fire of wanting people to be different than they are. Hatred is heavy. You have carried enough. If this story has touched something in you, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments. Not the dramatic version of your story, just the true version, the quiet one, the one you've maybe never said out loud. Those are the stories that matter. I'm 30 years old. I'm sitting at my desk on a Tuesday morning, and outside my window, the city is bright and loud and full of possibility. I have a meeting in an hour. I have a new acquisition on my desk that I find genuinely interesting. I have Dana's number in my phone and plans for dinner on Friday. I have a life that belongs entirely and undeniably to me. I am not finished. I am not close to finished. And that, quietly, solidly, without drama, is enough.